On April 23, 2006, a man in his early 20s was seen in Kiev, Ukraine, staring at a high-rise apartment building. Witnesses described him as looking confused and anxious. They thought he might have been a lost tourist. The man approached two police officers and nervously asked for directions to a place that didn't exist. The officers asked the young man for identification, but there were two problems with his ID. One, his documents were issued by the Soviet Union, which no longer existed. The second problem, according to his birth date, this young man was born in 1932. A Russian documentary called The Time Traveler told the story of Sergey Ponomarenko, a man who seemed to be slipping in and out of time. Eyewitnesses first saw Ponomarenko standing at an intersection in Kiev, looking confused and a little frightened. He was described as being in his early 20s and wearing clothes that looked new but were 50 years out of fashion. Ponomarenko was asking everyone he met how to get to Pashnaya Street, but nobody had heard of it. His strange behavior caught the attention of police officer Sergey and his partner, who approached him. Again, Ponomarenko wanted directions to Pashnaya Street. When he tried to find the street on a map, all that was there was a landfill. Officer Ananpenko now took notice of Sergey's vintage clothing that looked brand new. He also noticed that Sergey was wearing an antique camera around his neck, which also looked new. But what really caught the police officer's attention was Sergey's identification. According to the document, Sergey was born in Kiev in 1932, which should make him 74 years old. But here he was, looking older than 25. What surprised them most was his identification papers. The papers were dated 1958, but they were like new. It was a photograph that looked similar to this man, but how could it be him? They assumed this person was out of his mind and needed to see a psychiatrist. Sergey Ponomarenko didn't want to see a psychiatrist, but his options were that or be arrested for vagrancy. So Sergey was taken to a private psychiatric clinic where everything is captured on video. And that's when things get really strange. Dr. Kritikov said he had seen patients who create stories like this, but in Sergey's case, something was different. Doctor asked Sergey how he ended up here. Sergey told the doctor that he had a day off from work, so he took his camera and walked around the city. At some point, he looked up into the sky and saw an object shaped like a bell moving very erratically. The doctor asked if he was describing a UFO, but Sergey had never heard that word before. Sergey said it's too hard to describe. It would be easier to just develop the film. He took a picture of the UFO and then traveled 50 years into the future. Dr. Kritikov agreed to develop Sergey's film. While waiting for the photographs, Kritikov wanted Sergey to stay in the clinic for a few days for observation. At that point, the doctor realized that Sergey kept looking at the clock on the wall. The clock stopped, so Dr. Kritikov checks his watch and notices that it also has stopped. When Sergey went back into the lobby, the clocks in the doctor's office started working again. At this point, Dr. Kritikov didn't fully believe Sergey's story, but he was intrigued by what might be on the film. And unsurprisingly, it developed just fine. The pictures looked familiar to Dr. Kritikov. He recognized Kiev, but the photographs were of Kiev in the late 1950s. Another photo showed Sergey Ponomarenko sitting in front of a house. Dr. Kritikov noticed that Sergey came to his office wearing the same clothes as in the photograph, clothes that looked clean and new. Another picture showed a young woman in her early 20s. Kritikov assumed this was Sergey's girlfriend. The final photograph in the film was the most amazing one of all. An object shaped like a bell, just as Sergey described, was in the sky above the city. On his third day in the clinic, Sergey had another session with Dr. Kritikov to discuss the photos. After the session, Sergey went to his room. That was the last time anyone would see him. Sergey Ponomarenko was gone, even though there were cameras on the only exit and his windows were covered with metal bars. He somehow disappeared. Even if the window was open, it's impossible to climb through the bars. There's only one entrance and exit. All that was left was a newspaper and his notes with the doctor's questions. Dr. Kritikov contacted the police to locate him. Officer Ananpenko went to the address that Sergey put on his intake form at the clinic. Of course, nothing was there. But they learned that Sergey's apartment building was torn down and the residents were moved to a larger building nearby that was built in the early 1960s. That building was still standing. By digging through the building's records, Ananpenko found that Sergey did in fact live in that building for 20 years. That's where Sergey's story hits another snag. According to police records, Sergey Ponomarenko was missing. The police report contained a picture of Sergey who certainly looks like the man they saw earlier, but about 20 years older. He was last seen leaving his building in 1978 with his camera and was never seen again, but Sergey's file contained something else interesting. In 1958, he was interviewed on a radio program where he made predictions about the future. Though there is plenty of information about Sergey in old Soviet files, they were no closer to locating him than the police. Then, they had an idea: there might be a person who could shed some light on Sergey Ponomarenko and what might have happened to him. The woman in the photographs, her name was Valentina Kulis, and she was still alive. Tracking Sergey Ponomarenko was difficult. He shows up in the year 2006 out of nowhere, then disappears a few days later. He reappears sometime in the past, makes accurate predictions about the future, and then disappears again. But Sergey did leave behind the photographs he took before he went missing the first time. In those photographs was the picture of a young woman. Her name was Valentina Kulis, and she was living in the apartment building where Sergey was last seen. Valentina said that she and Sergey were good friends for many years, but he went missing in 1978 and was presumed dead. His belongings were thrown away and his apartment was sold. But Valentina did have a picture of him. "It was a long time ago, but I have one good picture left," she said. This was taken in 1958. They compared Valentina's photo to the pictures on Sergey's camera. They were pictures of the same people wearing the same clothes, taken on the same day. Valentina asked what this was about, and the police and Dr. Kritikov said they thought someone could be impersonating Sergey. That it could be someone mentally ill claiming they had traveled in time. Then, Valentina took out an envelope. She said that a few years ago, she came home one day and in her mailbox was an envelope with no postmark or writing of any kind. Inside the envelope was a picture of Sergey. When compared to the picture at the time of his disappearance, he hadn't aged at all. But even more strange is the background of the photograph. You can see the motherland statue over Sergey's right shoulder. There's no question that this is Kiev. Investigators went to the exact spot where Sergey took the picture. They found the location, but the rest of the skyline is wrong. Kiev doesn't have all those skyscrapers, at least not yet. On the back of the photograph was a message to Valentina written in Sergey's own handwriting: "Dearest Valentina, everything is fine with me. I'll try to return when I can. Yours, Sergey." It would seem that Sergey Ponomarenko had jumped into the future once again. But considering how big Kiev looks in the photos, there's no way to tell just how far into the future Sergey's traveled. It's obviously pretty far. As of 2011, when this documentary was released, Sergey had not reached out to Valentina, nor was he spotted anywhere in the city. So, if we're going to solve this mystery, we're apparently going to have to wait a long, long time.